My name is Steve Bankston, and I'm the chair of the board of the Churchill Club. Welcome. We're pleased to be here at PARC on the occasion of their 40th anniversary and our own 25th anniversary. How many people have been at PARC before? Both of our organizations are passionate about innovation and contributing to economic growth, and we're proud of our contributions over the years. It seems fitting that we would team up this evening and explore the question, can innovators learn from the past? We have with us a distinguished group of speakers, Apte, Ron Kaplan, Dave Liddle, Teresa Lunt, and of course, Mark Bernstein. Thank you all and welcome. I have a few brief announcements. Our next program is on Tuesday, November 30th, entitled Wireless is the Biggest Tech Platform in History. Now what? Our speakers are Paul Jacobs, CEO of Qualcomm, and John Rubinstein, former CEO of Palm, now a senior executive with HP. Kara Swisher of All Things D will moderate. Students in the audience, Qualcomm has reserved a block of tickets for you to attend this program free. Simply write to info@churchillclub.org and request a Qualcomm student pass, or you can stop by the desk tonight on the way out, and one of our staff members will help you. For those of you who are not aware of it, PARC hosts regular PARC Forum events right here in this auditorium on Thursday nights at 6 p.m. The events are free, so the price is hard to beat, and feature some of the world's leading experts in a variety of topics, such as the future of networking and novel electronics. Visit parc.com for more information. The Churchill Club is a member-supported organization. We offer many benefits for both individuals and corporations. If you're not a member, I hope you'll consider joining us. Complete information is available on our website at churchillclub.org. And in honor of our 25th anniversary, we're running some special offers this week for both new and existing members. Please check your program tonight or check in at the registration table for more details. Last announcement, if you're tweeting this evening, please use the hashtags Churchill Club and PARC, P-A-R-C. Thanks. It's my honor to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our speakers. Mark Bernstein is the CEO of PARC, one of the world's premier R&D businesses with a remarkable history of innovation. Here at PARC, Mark leads about 200 experts in fields as diverse as material science, distributed computing, human factors, mathematics, linguistics, and sociology. His passion is to see the results of their work influence the world in many and meaningful ways. Please welcome Mark Bernstein.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome to all of you. It's great to have you here. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel, and then we'll get to the questions. We'll try and cover a pretty broad range of topics, past, present, and future, about what can be learned and what has been learned about innovation, and then we'll look forward to engaging you in a continuing conversation once we're through here. First, to my immediate left is Dave Liddle, who's held positions in research, senior management, entrepreneurship, and now in venture capital as a partner at U.S. Venture Partners. Seated next to him is Ron Kaplan, who at PARC was a research fellow and for 25 years led natural language research here at PARC. He left PARC to form PARCevent as the Chief Science Officer to apply that PARC technology to semantic search. And after Microsoft acquired PARCevent, he is now a principal researcher at Microsoft Bing. Or as Steve Ballmer says it, Bing! Yeah. So our two current PARC employees, we have Teresa Lunt, who's VP and head of our computing science lab here at PARC, which is focused on networking, contextual intelligence, ethnography, security, and privacy. Prior to her time here at PARC, she was Assistant Director for Distributed Systems and Program Manager for Information Security at DARPA, and was also Director for Computer Security at SRI, pioneering work in intrusion detection and database security. And last but not least, we have Raj Apte, who's a senior engineer here at PARC, also an area manager. And his work has been focusing on prototyping novel applications of inorganic thin film transistor technology. He's also uniquely distinguished by being the smartest person he knows, and brings a tremendous amount of vigor to every conversation he participates in. So you may notice that there's a PARC bias here, which is intentional. But I want to characterize a little bit of what that should mean for you as an audience. I think that the research perspective that we have all shared at some point in our careers really does take a kind of a long-term view of the path from research to innovation that finds itself in the world. So we're talking kind of transformative space, not incremental improvements on existing technology as that innovation perspective. My favorite PARC characterization of innovation came from Bob Metcalf when he was here a few years ago celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Ethernet here. And Dave was here also, may recall that his characterization runs something like, innovation is a flower, innovation is a weed.
Invention.
What did I say?
You said innovation was both.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's not correct. That's not what I have written here. So, yeah.
Repeat after me.
Okay, invention is a flower. Innovation is a weed. So this learned persistence and adaptability is not something that happens naturally as a consequence of just being a researcher. It actually takes experience. So let's start to explore what that is with the first question that I've framed here, based on your own personal experiences. Each of them have unique, one from the other. What are the serviceable lessons that you've learned about innovation as it relates to your PARC heritage? So, Dave, why don't you start us off?
When I was in PARC, and then after that SDD, where we were bringing to market some work that had started in PARC, that transition from research to doing new products was the trickiest part. And I've subsequently seen that in almost all corporate research environments, that's still the hardest part. But there were some things that were very special about the way research was done here that was different than what I had seen then or have seen anywhere else until some years later. Paul Allen and I started a research and an incubator lab, and that place I tried to practice a number of the things that we had learned here. One of the big ones, most of the people in the computer-related laboratories did not work on only one project here. And so I subsequently made that rule that everyone needed to work on more than one project, because it gives you a little distance from your work, okay? And after a few years, you can declare it a success and do something else if it's not the only thing that you've been doing. Exactly. So that was a really good thing about PARC of the 70s, you know, when I was here. Another very useful sort of stylistic thing was that they were not really narrow stovepipes. There was, if you really wanted to work on another project, you pretty much could. It didn't really matter exactly which lab or area it was in. And that was accepted and encouraged. And I think that was a reason for a lot of the high quality of the work that we did in those days, because there was very good cross-pollination. And the idea of actually including behavioral scientists in the whole research endeavor too. I mean, I remember making a big impassioned plea about how we really ought to hire these two guys, Tom Moran and Stu Card, you know, and get them to, even though they could write code, of course, everyone could write code. That was an absolute requirement. But I mean, they were not pick and shovel engineering types at all. And that just made a lot of the work blossom by having just even two such folks. And so subsequently, I've always focused on that as well, that you realize the great amplification effect on your engineering team and your product marketing people of having behavioral scientists around. So those are a few things that I regard as having been special and different than about PARC, and that made a very big difference to the quality of the work that we did. By now, many research labs imitate some of that. Some of them still haven't learned that lesson, but those things, at least I recall, as being really important.
Yeah, very, very unique, and I think we'll come back to touch on that uniqueness as we go through the conversation here. Ron, what do you bring?
I can build a little bit on the point that you made about people doing lots of different things. I think that was kind of essential for a lot of the things that happen in terms of both invention and innovation. And there are different ways of kind of characterizing the dimensions. One is, working on different projects, different people kind of getting together to maybe even outside their area, their particular focus area, to contribute, to help, to build the infrastructure that we had to build at that time. But I think there was also a spread, and I think this was very important, at least in the kind of trajectory that I followed, of having both people and teams that had, at different times, different kinds of ambitions about what they wanted to accomplish. So at different times in research and development, you have kind of a long-term vision. Like there's some deep scientific problem that you want to understand, you want to solve. In my case, I wanted to understand how the human mind, let's get very, very flowery, it could understand human languages in linguistics. And then you start backing that out into very, very concrete things. So you have this long-term goal that's kind of a guiding light, if you will. And then you back that out to, well, we're going to build computer models of the human mind, and we're going to build programming languages that will help us build computer models, and you get back to, the first step in linguistics, from the human mind goes down to words, individual words, and all of a sudden you have something that's practical, and you have kind of an extrinsic motivation. That is, there's some purpose, some customer or client, not just your long-term scientific vision, but something that you can do that people can appreciate that will actually make a difference. In our case, it was spell checking. So the first step in understanding how the human mind uses human language was to build spell checkers. And that's sort of a gap, but I think that it's having that kind of spread of interests and desires and so forth, one to have impact, one to understand something, that actually kind of feeds on itself and kind of nurtures the kind of research activity. And you find that in a cyclical way. I think, at different times, different people will be kind of focusing on the long term or the short term. Different teams may be going through that kind of cycle. And it's always good to kind of refresh from one of those back to the other. Because either one of them, if you focused on the concrete things that your next customer wants, you get lost in the weeds. Or you get lost in invention.
Yeah.
So it's kind of getting that kind of cyclical mix that I think was a key aspect of innovation at PARC.
It's a bit like the rhythm you were referring to, Dave, about being able to participate in multiple projects and to be able to reset your perspective in a way that makes things fresh when you return to them.
And I would add one more thing, that in an environment where other people can appreciate the other things that you're doing. That's very, very important. That, you know, you don't have to defend, you don't have to kind of excuse, say, well, you know, this is interesting too, and I'm going to do that for a while. And I think that's been an important aspect of innovation that was here, and I think in general, innovation that actually has an effect on the world.
That's a good observation. Teresa?
Well, I can build on some of these things. Like, for example, the fact that we're such a small research center, fewer than 200 researchers, and we're doing something like 50 projects at any given time, and we're in probably 40 or 50 disciplines, that you can't avoid working closely together with people who are in vastly different fields, and it really has informed the work we do. And now that we've got business development people also at PARC, and that's part of the mix, and so people are not only thinking about the technology, but they're thinking about the effect of that technology on the world and how it's going to be adopted, and all of that thinking informs their choice of projects and how they approach the projects. And it's also interesting to see these collections of people from different areas sitting down at the lunch table and just batting ideas around about what are, for example, the social impacts of our technology. Can we disintermediate these powerful brokers so that we can get direct access to information or direct access to services, or empower the creation of new services by ordinary people at very low costs? And that kind of thing is really possible today. It's all part of the mix of what's motivating researchers. Now that we don't have to build a lot of our own infrastructure, it makes so many more things possible too. So it's, I think, also part of that mix of being informed by what's happening in the world is this huge influx of visitors that we have, for example, with the forum or with our seminar series and our lab presentations. All of that, I think, helps create a really vibrant research culture here.
And it's interesting to observe the social phenomena that we've experienced here over the 40 years. And you talk about back in the olden days when we actually were building our own infrastructure here, when computation wasn't a Best Buy trip. And I mean, there was really a lot of social congress just around what the design and implementation, who was going to get the first machine, where it was, which project it was going to be directed toward. I got here in the late 70s, and at that time, being in a hardware lab, we were just starting to get Altos when all the big kids were getting the big machines that had to be air conditioned in a different part of the building. So yeah, this whole social interaction around research and the perspectives about the role that we play in helping each other's research through the social interactions is really important.
Just one little comment on that point and this infrastructure point. And Ron was talking about how here's what you would like to do, and then here's an obvious fundamental ingredient of that, and then here's what would be required to get there. I can remember in 1973 people saying, okay, the speech guys, the language guys, meaning Ron and Danny Barbara and all those people, they need to add 1 bit to the real address space and 2 bits to the virtual address space every year. And so for that reason, that was one of the reasons that Max, for example, that big machine was built the way that it was, because it was thought that Danny Barbara would quit complaining for several years if we did that.
That was a nice theory.
But it was entirely donated, if I can put it that way, by the hardware people to try and support the language work, okay? And then as soon as that was done, everybody said, ugh, no more big machines. And well, same team all went off and began to work on the Alto and on other things. But nobody assigned them to do that. It's just that they sort of, it was lunch table conversation about, well, what are we going to do?
Yep.
You know, how are we going to run the next big programs?
But that cycled again with the Dorados.
Yeah.
And so then the big machines came back.
But
But I have to say that when I was first deciding whether to come to PARC and asking about computation and infrastructure, so I was told that all these hardware guys were going to build these machines for me. So I said, well, okay, that's nice. That we were going to be the drivers for them to do their thing.
we thought of it as you being the excuse, but nevertheless.
So we have a different sense of the transit on the hardware side from computers that Raj is familiar with. What do you bring from that perspective as you think back?
Yeah, I guess I thought about, notwithstanding your introduction to me, it was actually a fairly humbling reflection to think about the projects that I've been involved with over the last 15 years. And it started off with working with the PARC spin-out, trying to develop medical X-ray imaging, which succeeded fantastically. But in the process, I realized that I could never predict the future accurately. And part of the whole purpose of today is to talk about the future, but predicting the future is really, really hard. And what I realized in thinking about several of the projects is projects that I thought were absolutely doomed to fail sometimes succeeded wonderfully. And projects that I thought made no sense, had no business model, were complete duds, ended up finding a path to the sea. And I don't know how to incorporate that into a business model that makes sense for looking at the future of innovation, because that level of chaos is simply unmanageable. But that's kind of the level of chaos in my own head looking at the projects that I've worked on. And I don't envy people who have to choose projects because it's really hard.
Yeah, it is. I think all of us here have had that experience about when to step away, or as you referred to it, Ron, when you feel the time is right in order to test an artifact of the research with a real application requirement, and is the future still as you remembered it, a few years ago? And that certainly is something I don't think has changed appreciably. I think that obviously a lot of research projects happen much more quickly than they did in the past, just by virtue of the technology that we have at our disposal. But certainly, as you think about the uncertainties don't change. I think our abilities to try and transit them with new tools or modeling or whatever has really made a big difference. So, as you go take a step forward to the present, and you think about what is de rigueur today at PARC, and how you think about research in the present day, are there any of these threads that we've talked about? We've talked about the social interaction across disciplines and across multiple projects. We've talked about the role of planning a research project, and particularly a long-term research project. What are the threads about research today that you see kind of persisting from 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when you think about the purpose for research?
Well, one of the things that you see, in my opinion, in most corporate research environments, unlike PARC, which has both a corporate mission from Xerox and then the ability to do other work as well. Most of those, the traditional large ones, have greatly narrowed their focus. There are some more recent, very big, successful companies that now have the wherewithal to do more free-form research. But, in the past there wasn't Google, Microsoft, Intel. It was a different group. The problem that I see with that trend, the narrowing trend, is there's so much good luck involved in successful research. And so let me make up some statistics. Let's say you do 100 projects, okay? And 10 of them turn out to have reasonable commercial value and reasonable commercial promise, let's say. And if you're doing that well, that's pretty good. I mean, that's a pretty good hit rate. And then the problem is sometimes a corporation will come under competitive or financial pressure, and they'll say to people in a beautiful laboratory in a hilly place, you know, like this, or Almaden, or, you know, upstate New Jersey, or, you know, they'll come to them and say, okay, that was good, that 10% hit rate, but we want you now to focus down more on our core business, so all 10 of your good ideas out of the next 100 will all help our main business. That doesn't work that way. You ruin the statistics, and you'll get 2 that will help the main business, and the other 8 will never get done, because when that freedom is there, you can do things that are valuable, but they may not feed the bulldog. They may not match that main thing. That's a problem. There's a related problem, and then I'll get off my soapbox about this. There's a related problem that tends to happen. Some of this comes from the brief time I spent in IBM after they acquired my company, Metaphor. And there is a tendency, again, when you have this nice lab with all these great people that you carefully selected, and you're at maximum size, you don't want to lose any of them, and they don't want to leave. So you are the VP who's responsible for that. Company starts getting in trouble, and you raise your hand and say, yeah, I know everybody else is taking a 10% cut, but if you let me keep my whole team, we can solve this problem. Okay, we've got something here that's really going to be great, and it will help our competitive position and get us out of the fix we're in. This has 2 bad effects. Number one, you have a bunch of researchers, and they are not doing research anymore, and you're losing the opportunity. Number 2, God help you, they are doing development. And you're sort of giving rifles to the band. You're sort of asking for a very different kind of commitment, you know what I mean? Yeah. And a different skill set. And these are people that are smart, but you carefully chose them for a rather different set of capabilities. When we started SDD here in Xerox, we did have a bunch of people from PARC come over, but many, many, many more we had to go out and find, because we needed primarily people very driven by engineering challenges and the programming challenges of computer science and so on. So all that I'm saying is I see those 2 things as bad trends in corporate research environments. I feel like PARC is getting kind of close to having a pretty good hybridized model here. Most research labs need a base customer, like SRI has in the government, that kind of keeps the lights on and keeps the doors open and so on. So then you can afford to license some of your stuff or to do spin-off companies, but you're not counting on that to pay the rent. And paying the rent by licensing or betting on the good luck of startup companies is too hard for a broadly based research lab, because the statistics are very likely to wound you. So a few labs are learning that lesson. That's what I think is exciting about the current business model of PARC, is that it's just about on the verge, I think, of proving that this flexible approach can work. I mean, time will tell, but I like that it's going in that direction. And I wish that other corporate research organizations were doing more of that.
Yeah. Well, I think you know, the other research investments that Xerox has are very eager for us to be successful, but not too successful. But I think to your point, the countervailing effect of having that independent side of your research agenda helps offset that kind of narrowing that naturally has occurred as, you know, the hollowing out of corporations and the drive for financial performance has really kind of dominated the purpose for enterprises these days. So. And you probably won't have to wait that long, I think, for us to prove that it is working. But to your other point, it doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
You have learning that needs to occur, and that comes from being smart about which examples you choose to learn from.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the problem here is that in order to go from an invention to something that really has impact, it takes a tremendous amount of additional investment. And that investment may or may not be with the kind of people that you have. They may be very flexible. They may have lots of different skills, as the people at PARC did in the early days. But you have to make some choices, and this goes to the point you were making. And if you're a researcher and you're solving deep problems with kind of an architecture maybe to them, and a lot of different ways in which you can imagine them being applied, because you know how wonderful everything is. And you know that each of those possible paths is going to be worth $10 billion in 10 years. But then you take the uncertainty and the exponential discounting of the future that goes along with that. They're all worth $10 today, so nothing is really worth getting out of bed for. You need to have some other kind of guidance coming from some outside signal of some sort, from a market or from a client or a customer, whatever it is. Maybe it's from the corporate. And then you have the problem that becomes too dominant. So the real issue in here is, how do you balance the need to kind of do something specific and the costs that go along with that, with the fact that that means you will in fact be giving up a lot of opportunity, even if you can't recognize that at the time.
Right.
That's always been the tension in the corporate research. One antidote is to keep kind of close connections to more of the academic community and the kind of the scientific community and so forth. You might say, well, the universities for the culture, for the society, are kind of serving that function of maintaining the breadth and depth and so forth. That's not necessarily true anymore, because they're very, very constrained by government funding of one sort or another, or by trying to do licensing deals of one sort. I mean, everybody is sort of, particularly now, very concerned with survival. And in a way, we need, the Medicis to come back and give us a little bit of a vacation from some of these pressures.
I guess I might have something a little bit different to say from David about the economic pressures that affect research. And I've just found in my experience that having some kind of a customer who has a problem that's got possibly very focusing constraints, presents more of a research challenge in some ways, can be the impetus behind progress in some direction that if left to our own devices, we may have been going in many, many directions with the technology. I mean, we're working right now with one for a large customer, our content-centric networking technology, and how as painful as it can be to work with a very demanding customer, it does mean that we have made tremendous progress, that we in a direction where as those energies may have been spent in a variety of smaller things in the absence of that customer. And so at the same time, too, I think having to invent with the customer and understand what this could do for that company has us really think about the possibilities in a different way. And it's been hard, but it's been really we've been inventing even beyond. We've been able to invent beyond where the customer wants to go. So we've got ideas for other projects beyond that. And so I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are pressures, and it's not always pleasant.
As we all know. Yeah.
Teresa, would you say that, see, it always feels to me like you do want some kind of a coherent overall mission for a lab.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be terribly narrow. I mean, for us, it was the office of the future. That was sort of the general thing that we were trying to work on. So there were other areas that we did not go into, but we made a broad interpretation of that. And if you have that and you're working in that space, then every once in a while you find one of these really good, very specific problems that gives you boundary conditions to work with. What's hard is if it's like getting a MacArthur grant or something and you just have this money and you can do anything you want without either some overall mission or something, it's pretty hard to make it coherent, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, what do I do today, you know? I'm interested in X, but should I, and it's what Ron said, you know, you wake up in the morning and you say, what signals is the universe sending me that I want to do this?
And where's it coming from?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, I think that, you know, we talked about this a little bit before we started our discussion about that need for something to drive a specific application of the technology to a set of market requirements or constraints that you don't either know, appreciate, or understand. And I think that's the value that you get from customer interactions that share a sense of promise for what the research could mean, and is more than happy to drive you relentlessly to tears to get what they believe that they've contracted for. So it is painful, but I think it's a necessary part of the experience of discovering what it takes for this innovation to actually make itself visible in a meaningful way. And then if it's successful or not, of course, is yet another set of questions that we don't, again, signals from the universe, which constitutes a lot of markets. Raj.
Well, I resonate with something that Ron said. He mentioned the Medicis, and of course, venture capitalists and private equity are the Medicis of today. And I think that actually it's instructive to look at the history of science innovation over not a 40-year span, but say a 400-year span. When you think about Leonardo da Vinci, he started painting, he started drawing, he became fascinated with the universe around him, and he needed to pay the bills. And he thought about how to pay the bills, and he ended up putting together a business plan for building dikes and irrigation canals in order to improve the production of rice in the areas around the Principate that he was bidding on. And he did what I think of as the classic scientist move. He did what he wanted with part of his time, and with the rest of his time, he sold it to build stuff that was useful to make money for somebody else. And that's my business model today. So it's a classic business model, and it just works. And I was also reflecting on Edison's position, because when Edison began his work on basically inventing the modern era, there weren't corporate research labs. Research was something that was done funded by rich people or funded by organizations, but it was sort of sporadic. And people didn't have to be rich to do research. I remember reading Royal Transactions papers from the 1800s where, you know, people who were teaching high school would do research, and they would publish things in the Royal Society. And so there's an example of teaching and doing research in addition to doing research and building things useful for rich people. But the rise of the corporate research lab, I think, made us all lazy, because it gave us an opportunity to pay the rent, and pay our personal rent, and have a kind of a more orderly process of innovation. And I think we're now back to that model that Edison had, or that Da Vinci had, which is you need to go and raise money for specific projects, and you basically can do science and you can do engineering together. And I think the best argument for that is the 2000 crash, which I think is really instructive. The 2000 crash told us that there is a surplus of capital in the world, a surplus of savings and wealth that people are trying to throw at technology in order to make money, which means that there's more money than we know what to do with. So given that there's more money than we know what to do with,
We took care of that problem.
well,
That was then.
the investment bankers took care of that
Yes,
recently,
right.
but I think that problem will come back. I think we will again be in a world where there's too much savings and there's not enough innovation for that infinite amount of savings to invest in. And so we're now back in that situation where individual innovators can create projects by bidding on them, and that's what venture capitalists do. And PARC, in its own case, does the same thing internally. We bid on projects, we create new projects all the time, and we're trying to bid on basically getting rich off of our ideas. So I really see a plain and simple continuum, and to me the exceptional period is the strange post-World War II period up till 1975 or 80 or maybe 1984, the Bayh-Dole Act, which really kind of changed things. But when PARC was founded, we were living in a very weird universe where corporate research labs were inventing everything. And that was not true 100 years before, and I don't think that's going to be true in the future. I think it's going to be small labs and small individuals doing their own thing.
Yeah, so as we talk about the future, where do we think that innovation is going to be sourced from? I think that we all agree that government funding, certainly in the United States, is not what it has been, certainly not what founded Silicon Valley around the space program. And the likelihood of that reoccurring, I don't know what the time frame was for your profound abundance, but it certainly doesn't look like it's in next year's government budget by at least everything I've seen. So where is innovation going to come from if it's not going to come from the largesse of corporations and monopolies in the corporate labs or the government creating opportunities for new knowledge from science to be created?
Well, maybe this is a good point to talk about the difference between invention and innovation a little bit going forward. And by the way, Raj, we venture capitalists don't insist on being compared to the Medici, but just don't compare us to the Borgias. The trick, I think, is that it's hard to use these words without hurting someone's feelings when we're talking about what is invention and what's innovation and so on. But venture capital gets invested most of the time in things that we would call innovation. Now, they may be patented and have inventors, but I mean, they're not cataclysmic big changes. They are usually faster, better, cheaper. 80% of the time, they're faster, better, cheaper. 20% of the time, they're a brave new world, as we say. And with faster, better, cheaper, that means you already know this is something that people buy and want and need. And so you're going to succeed or fail in the lab because if it works, then you know where to sell it and who will buy it and so on. And failing in the lab is relatively inexpensive. Brave New World has the property that nobody else does this at all. And so if it works at all, it won't be because it failed in the lab. It'll be because people decided not to buy it or wouldn't pay what you needed to charge them for it. And that's bad because you're failing in the market, and that's expensive, okay? So the trick, and part of what's hard about this is that the innovations tend to focus on those faster, better, cheapers, as they should. You know, if you're a venture capitalist, the money you have is from, widows and orphans and pension funds and hospitals and all that kind of stuff. So you're supposed to somewhat prudently invest it and try to produce a return for them. And that effect of itself tends not to favor really bold new strokes. So the Brave New World stuff tends to come from either academic or otherwise funded real research, where people can take a longer stride, so to speak, and try something, and they're not embarrassed or fired if it sounds like a dumb idea. It's a place, they're in a place where that's acceptable. Okay. And that to me is the biggest worry. I see a lot, much more innovation than we used to get, and much less invention in that Xerox PARC kind of sense. You know, it doesn't happen in quite the same way. And the sources for funding, Ron and I were talking about this on the phone, the sources for funding that kind of work aren't the same as they were. And to the extent they fund work, it tends to be shorter duration. So, you know, I went to graduate school because of ARPA. It didn't have its D yet, okay? And, you know, and it was very easy to do a 4-year PhD, no problem. You know, they had a lot of projects that lasted much longer than that, but nowadays it's very difficult. And, you know, and then National Science Foundation, it's one for Oklahoma, one for Arizona, da-da-da-da. You know, I mean, that's very politicized, and it's not the kind of prioritized investment that you want. So it's going to be corporate research, and it's going to be independently funded academic research. It's going to give us, in my own view, those real inventions that really change the game, the sort of thing that PARC's reputation is built on. IBM is a formidable research organization, amazing, but they are the absolute best at faster, better, cheaper. And in the drag race with Intel in the semiconductor business, I'd bet on IBM for a given capability. You know what I mean? But that's their focus. They're not interested in all kinds of other fancy stuff. You know, they stick to those very, very crucial things. And it's a great research laboratory, but there aren't so many places now where you can really take a flyer and try something very, very new. So, you know, I think that will be our worry. I mean, the worry for all of us, you know, for the next 20 years is where that suite of really high-risk, long strides will come from. Because innovation isn't going to be the problem. It's going to be real deep-seated invention, I think.
You know, one of the trends that's going on now is sort of the kind of decentralization or democratization of the tools, at least in the kind of computer science kind of thing, of the tools that people need to actually do, you know, do advanced experimentation and so forth. The kind of communication networks, the open source, all these things that are happening that enable lots of individuals in lots of different places to collaborate and to share and so forth. That could be a source of invention. It probably won't be a source of innovation because that really does take somebody kind of deciding that they really want to do it and they don't want to do it with everybody else.
Focus
and so forth.
and dedicated.
You know, focus and dedicate. But so there's kind of maybe the optimistic view is that will replace some of the funding models that we've had. People can, you know, volunteer to do pieces on their own initiative if they're an academic or even as a hobby or whatever, and people can make progress. The possible downside there, the thing that I would worry about, is that you're not assembling kind of a critical mass. You can't kind of organize it in a way that things have to kind of build on top of, you know, one thing has to build on top of the next. You get more of a flat kind of landscape with maybe not enough peaks and maybe not even enough valleys. So I think there's the good side is everybody can do it, and they can do it with their friends and people around the world and so forth. The bad side is that maybe there's no strategy associated with it. There's no kind of accumulation of insight. And my own concern in thinking about some of these things is that, as we were talking before, expertise and scholarship are not necessarily the coins of the realm anymore.
That's right.
So part of the democratization is a little bit of a mob kind of thing, to put it in a kind of negative way, that there's not much less respect for people who spend a lot of time really fundamentally and deeply understanding something before they have some sort of distributable kind of output. So there's the wisdom of the crowds as a kind of a metaphor that one could worry about. But I think in the next 5 years or so, it may just come from the kind of societal movement that's going on.
Yeah. But it's hard to imagine a persistent source of invention and innovation in that kind of future.
It is.
Yeah.
It's so you get back to kind of incremental, incremental and better, faster, and so forth. And deep inside, well, I don't know. Maybe all the easy insights have been done. I don't know. We're all going to be doing Web 5.0, by then. I don't know. And you'll be investing in it.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think, like, over the last century, how research funding has changed from wealthy individuals who took on projects as hobbies and built big projects like the huge sky telescope at Palomar, for example, and then after World War II, the government decided it had to play a role, and then that was the majority investor in R&D, technology R&D, and then corporate America grew up, far outstripped the government investment, and now it's becoming more difficult to sustain that, and we could be back to the wealthy investor model, like the investor in interval investors. I mean, private individuals coming together to, who've benefited from this whole industry, a set of industries that have been enabled by, the technology that we've created, and now able to come back and seed those things. And I don't know. I'm just speculating, but I don't know how big that could be, or if it could sustain anything like what's happened in the past.
I guess I see a really rosy future for innovation.
I knew you would.
As we discussed. But it's true that there is a problem for invention, and to me, of course, Murray Hill, New Jersey, is the focus of my attention. I mean, that's where everything around us was invented, it seems, and the things that weren't invented there were invented by alums of the people, alums from Murray Hill. Everything happened there, and the magic there was that the government told AT&T for every dollar you put into Murray Hill, you could charge $1.05 in your government-sponsored monopoly and get your money back, and you could make 6% easy, 5% easy. And that 5% was sort of guaranteed because there was ratepayers in a government-sponsored monopoly. But that's not where the magic comes in, because the government can easily throw money at things. The magic comes because AT&T then was in charge of choosing the projects, and AT&T understood telecoms, and they understood the problems they were facing in telecoms. And so the idea, when people proposed that we could make a solid-state version of vacuum tubes, they were excited. And when people proposed that they could build optical communications, they were very excited. So I think that the understanding in the part of the market of the problems that need funding is really valuable, and that's really where you want your decisions being made. And it's just a question of funneling the large amount of surplus capital that up until 2 years ago the world enjoyed, and we will enjoy again. And so I see a couple of, I see many possibilities for government to do that, and I see many possibilities for our existing monopolies that are really not stepping up to the plate. They're doing innovation, but they're not doing invention. And I see that there are great opportunities for them to step up to the plate too. So I think we're in a brief hiatus. Historically, Bell Labs has only disappeared for a short time now. IBM is still there, but IBM is very narrowly focused. I grew up in a family of IBM Almaden people, and seeing that essentially close or nearly close is really heartbreaking. But it's a temporary hiatus, I think, and PARC is sort of going to be the I don't want to get too romantic, but we're the ones keeping the lights on, and hopefully we'll see American business step up and start tackling these problems again.
That's a fine hope. So I think it's probably about time to open it up to participation from all of you here in attendance tonight. We do have a microphone for those of you who aren't prone to yelling. Questions?
Should I need to stand up?
No.
Ah, thanks. See, most of the 20th century economy is built with solutions in search of problems. Those were all solutions that were invented, then they tagged to some problems, and then that created a marketplace. But most of the corporate America and most of the venture capitalists are willing to put money for somebody who can come and say, hey, this is the problem, and I have the greatest solution for that. So it is innovation-centric, not invention-centric. But all the inventions are originally solutions in search of problems. They were not designed at the time to solve the problem that they are solving now. So how do we reconcile, how do we encourage and build an ecosystem in the private space where people can come up with solutions in search of problems as opposed to faster, better, cheaper? Is there a philanthropic corpus capitalist fund that can do that kind of a stuff?
I'm going to write this down if you.
I think I'd like to address that just briefly.
Sure.
The history of Xerox Corporation is a really interesting one because you had a photographic film company called Haloid that was many decades old and knew that they were going to lose in the photographic paper market, and they were willing to bet the company on a new technology, and they needed to find what that new technology was. Chester Carlson was an inventor who had a crazy idea, and he didn't have a DARPA grant, and he didn't have a venture capitalist. He had Battelle. So he found a nonprofit memorial institute that was able to help him connect to Haloid and transition his crazy idea into a real product. And there was no marketplace for copiers, but it didn't take that much imagination to see that rooms full of people typing or transcribing things could be replaced by machinery. And he did that despite having an entire world war between the time he invented his copier and the time he could actually develop it as a product. So, I mean, I think that there's at least one example of how to do it. There is money out there for crazy people with crazy ideas, or at least there was in the 40s.
You know, I wonder if what you're saying is actually accurate, because I think it may be more like the inventor was actually solving a problem or trying to create a benefit at the very least, but that problem turned out not to be the problem, and now that technology is solving other problems. But it's hard for me to think of inventing in the no context of. Pardon me? Yeah. I mean, what I see more commonly is we have people dreaming things up that they don't really know what they're going to be applied to, and then other people come along and help them understand that. But they did think it was solving some problem, even if it was just a purely technical problem that they've run across, in their work. And here's just an easier way for me to build this thing like this. And now they've got an invention, but then nobody but them really cares about that thing, and so there's some other big application. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think you do see a lot of foraging for solutions in other applications. You look at 802.11 as an example of Russian radio technology that found its way into a broadly adopted solution for wireless. Or you look at the purpose for the web being able to simply, or ARPANET. You look at the purpose for which it was intended has a much broader implication in very different kinds of uses. So I don't think there's not necessarily the absence of a core invention there, but the innovation really is in being able to apply related technology for different solution spaces. So
I think what might be different is like just basic scientific discovery. That's a different kind of thing than invention.
That's very different.
Yeah.
And I think if you want to worry about basic scientific invention, the real problem there is that but in the post-Bay Dole world, most university professors are busy trying to do the research to get their startups funded and to have their public offering. And they're not necessarily focused on basic research, at least to a significant extent in the large research universities. People are interested in innovation, not in invention or in discovery, which is perhaps even the next step. And so I would worry about that. And since that's largely controlled by what we do in government, we have the controls to fix that.
So I think that, if you're kind of approaching it as a researcher trying to do innovation, like there's some value that you want to get out of it, you may have a particular problem in mind, and you may just kind of zero in on that problem and basically come up with an engineering solution to it that actually solves that need. But if what you're trying to do, if in doing that, you're actually looking for more general characterization, more modularity, kind of a more general architecture that subsumes that particular application and has a broader span, then that kind of gives you a little bit of insurance that even if that one doesn't work out, it will be good for something else, that you won't be kind of locked into, in the machine learning where they talk about overtraining.
Right, exactly.
And that's all you can do.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're not really doing invention. You're just solving a particular business problem, let's say. So keeping that kind of, we can do this, but if we did it this way, it may not be quite optimal for that, but it may have some other applications. And I think that's a kind of important sensibility that you want the inventors and maybe even the innovators to have.
Yeah, I agree. I think you want some percentage of the people that are doing research to sort of want to make plausible-looking prototypes of things that suggest or inspire ways that it might go, even if they're not reasonable in what they're going to cost or solving all of any particular problem. You need a fair number of people who are doing that. And as long as that happens, the other people who are primarily thinking and publishing and being parts of an intellectual community have that inspiration around them. When it's sad is when you got a bunch of people like that who don't have any of that inspiration around them, and then you just kind of get a tree full of owls. You don't really have a
kind of random walk.
Yeah, right, exactly. You don't really have a research lab with with either an esprit de corps or coherence. What I find is that in a lab, and I don't care if it's an industry or academia or what have you, if there aren't any things like that got somehow built and people could sort of touch and feel and so on, that gives people a lot of juice and spirit and energy. If you don't have that, all you have is sort of prestige and snottiness. And you don't have, and it's just being able to look down on other people elsewhere, but you don't necessarily have a good feeling that you're somehow making something coherent happen. That was, and as far as I can tell, still is a big thing about PARC, is that people are very driven that this is going to matter, and here's why I think it's going to matter. And in any case, we're giving it a good try, because look at this, it's something real sort of and concrete. And research labs that don't have that really miss out a lot, and yet it's surprising how often people don't understand that. There's some research labs that are more or less artist colonies, where there's a collection of really smart people there, but very, very little relationship between the things that they're working on or thinking about. And those are not fun to be in, and certainly not fun to pay for, I would think. And here it's kind of very much the opposite way, where so much of what gets done, PARC looks so practical, so to speak, that you have to sort out, well, okay, let's do a little more work and figure out could we meet cost targets or make a business out of this. But the drive to do things that will be practical or will have leverage seems to me always for 40 years to have been a big deal here, as far as I can tell. Certainly was when I was there.
Oh, I think that's persisted throughout, and you saw a little bit of it at our 40th celebration here. I think one of the things that is important for us as we do go into new spaces as we have in clean tech is that where we are unfamiliar with what the the shared metaphor for a prototype actually looks like in areas that are outside the IT spaces that we're most familiar with. That really, where there is so much ambiguity, you're forced to be concrete. Otherwise, you don't have a sense of what for and why that's really comprehended by everybody. So, next question. Yes.
I have a long-time curiosity question. 4 of the major research centers in the United States are all located here in Silicon Valley. And if you count IBM Almaden and HP Labs and Stanford University itself, you've got 7. You've got PARC, you've got SRI, you've got Ames, and you've got the Lockheed Lab right down here, the road here. And I know for sure in the late 70s and 80s, they were working on similar problems and conducting parallel investigations in many, many areas. Was there ever any bleed over or synthesis at all between the labs in those days and perhaps today?
Not that I ever saw. And we never hired anybody that done research anyplace else. They had to come straight from college, or we didn't touch them. I'm telling you the truth, man. We hired nothing but brand new PhDs, and that was it.
So I could give a slightly different.
But you wouldn't disagree with what I said.
I wouldn't disagree with what you said. Absolutely not. But in the early 80s, there was a general concern in the area, and actually in the country, but in the area about that research wasn't advancing, that there was a lot of siloing going on from different organizations and so forth, and there was a foundation, the System Development Foundation, that had a lot of money that they had to give away soon for legal and tax reasons. And that money was used to create a center at Stanford, which was called the Center for the Study of Language and Information, CSLI, that actually brought in SRI and PARC, and I think HP Labs and so forth, all around this theme of language and communication and so forth. And it was located at Stanford with satellite sites, one here, one at SRI, one at HP. And that was kind of a mechanism for bringing people together, not for necessarily hiring, that kind of thing, but having joint projects and trying to kind of do some of that bridging. And it lasted for about 5 years, I think, before centrifugal force kind of came along, money ran out, all those things happened. So it was an attempt.
And we did steal people from SRI, too, that's true.
Yeah, we did. I mean, we were not proud. We were not proud.
Yeah, we've done that as well, obviously. But there is, I think it is more through the migration of the people. I think you've seen more of it probably in the last 10 years because of this migration of technologies across industry boundaries and the complexity of so many aspects of technology being bound to computational components or platforms. So I think that's been more prominent over the last few years.
I think also in those days that we at PARC, because of the investment in the tools, we actually had the best research environment for the kind of research that would have been in common. And so there wasn't actually that much interest or need to go slumming, so to speak.
You do have a way with words.
That's what natural language will do for you.
Can I jump in with the next question?
Yes, please.
Maybe the model of selling physical things that we invent to customers that are stable organizations is over. Maybe the focus in the future is on the social side. It's reinventing the customer to sell them the fruits of the existing technologies that we have. If you listen to what you're saying about venture capital, the state of the economy, and all that, there's just a feeling that the existing institutional structure is not ready to do much beyond what it's doing. And that would be a whole totally different ball of wax if we could get into reinventing who the customer is.
So let me make sure I understand the point of the question. So you're saying that the intrinsic association between physical things and value is to be undone in some measure by.
It's gotten to a static point, and the
Yeah.
customers that we have are not going to select new technology.
So
Maybe it's reinventing the structures of governance, reinventing the way we do capital, reinventing how we handle things like climate change. It's on the customer side that the big innovations are going to come. They're going to be different institutions, and we need to find the ways of providing the technologies to help them do that.
So to take an example that I seriously don't understand are the customers who are paying real money to buy magical cows on Farmville. You know, like, is that where this is heading? Yeah.
Well, it is true that information technology tends to change its customer focus over time. And there's a whole long story about this. It's sort of boring, but I mean, if you usually, you know, we went through a period in the beginning, you know, God created mainframes and darkness was on the face of the deep, you know. And then after that, there were mini computers, and pretty soon mainframes were getting made out of mini computer components. And then there were workstations, and mini computers and mainframes were made out of workstation components, and then there were PCs, and workstations, mini computers, and mainframes were all made out of PC components. And now there are consumer devices, and all that stuff in the pipeline is all made from the technology of consumer devices. And so it is the case now that all of information technology, except for machines used to play chess, is a function of what's needed by low-cost consumer electronics, because that is the dominating stuff. I mean, even the Chinese machine is made out of graphics chips, right? So, you know, you see that is sort of happening, and we reach the customers now in completely different ways. There's soon will be no such thing as an enterprise software company where you got big expensive sales teams and all that kind of stuff. That just sort of doesn't work anymore. And we can see all the things that have happened to computing inside a company, and now it's starting to move outside of companies, both as a service or into all these funny devices. So while I think some of what you're talking about is happening to some extent, not perhaps so sharply, but the way that people buy consumer products and the way they think of them and their expectations of them and their demands upon them are so different than they used to be that pushes all the way back and transforms all of information technology. And I think we're just going to keep on seeing that for a long time. Probably eventually that will have some of these results that you're talking about, where the actual institutions of knowledge transfer and information utilities and so on will be very different than anything that we see now. So it may not take on a sociological change that's highly visible. It may be a more gradual change from a societal point of view, but just from the point of view where the economics are going and what you can invest in and what people buy and give value to and want to have and own, that's changed so profoundly just in even the last 10 years, let alone in the time frames we're talking about.
A question. Murray Hill, Almaden, Palo Alto, places. I'm amazed that here we are at the birthplace of the Ethernet, and nobody's talking about using networks to reach out of the building and form different types of communications. Thoughts? Death of distance.
Do you have something in mind?
Well, it just seemed to me that we're beyond the point where it's sort of we look at, the locus and think that's it, rather than, how we can bring the ideas from the world together and maybe rethink what's central to the model. I mean, I love visiting PARC, but there are a few people outside of Palo Alto, too, probably got something to, say here.
Well, I think that one aspect of the modern world is that it's exactly the same as the ancient world. In the post-war period, we had the unique experience, we Americans had the unique experience of having bombed most of Asia and most of Europe flat. And that is in a wonderful position to compete when everybody else doesn't have factories and they don't have electricity and they're just rebuilding their plumbing and all of that. So we had that massive advantage for 50 years, and now we've come to the end of that period. And we're in the same period that we were in 200 years ago to 2,000 years ago, where Imperial China looms as one of the great world powers and is technologically in advance of Europe, as it has been for most of recorded human history. And Mughal India is a major powerhouse in trading, as it has been since India started trading with Europe 3,000 years ago. So the idea that somebody in Cupertino would design a device and somebody in Taipei would manufacture it and ship it to somebody in New York or London, and I think that that's kind of what you're touching on, and I think that's already part of what we do. And I think that the modern world, I mean, globalization is sort of a trite term for that. But I think we're already seeing that globalization's been going on for 3,000 years, and it's still there. So I think it's just the last 50 years when we sort of could focus on a few places within the United States and not really pay attention to the rest of the world.
I might argue that it was invented by Genghis Khan, okay? Mm-hmm. No, I mean, you know what I mean, I think. Why? That he really drove this whole idea that any place I can run a road, I'm going to, and anytime I find a smart person, I'm dragging them back to Mongolia with me. Mm-hmm. And he actually did build he began, I think, that kind of globalization of ideas and motion of skills and so on that you're talking about. But, the fact that these research centers are where they are doesn't mean that we ignore people in the rest of the world. I've just done an investment in China, God help me, and that it's a semiconductor company, okay? It does stuff that I'm familiar with and have had a similar company elsewhere. And not surprisingly, the principals of it are all guys who came here and got PhDs at Stanford and Berkeley and then worked at, with Theros and Marvell and all that, and then decided they would go home. Well, I mean, they went home with all those ideas in their head, not just technologies, but cultural ideas and the various notions that they pick up here. And it's crystal clear that there are emerging technology centers and so on all over the world that aren't at the point of a gun made to look like this place. It's because they try it different ways and they say, not bad, that actually works, And I think we're seeing that. Also, places that culturally resist that don't do very good technology. Okay, I mean, it's been a long struggle in Western Europe to try and build an entrepreneurial technology community. Notwithstanding great university systems and very, very, very smart people, but it's kind of, not good to be in trade, I mean, and so it just hasn't caught on to do the kind of things that people do here.
That's that slumming notion I was
making. That's right, exactly. So I don't think there's any reason to, I certainly don't feel that there's anything particularly clannish about our industry the way there are about many. We've brought a lot of people into it, and they've many times gone home with good ideas and become competitors and collaborators and everything else. I think that information technology and its related topics, I think, is one of the healthiest industries imaginable in all those dimensions, in diversity, in sort of cultural strength, in the ability to support fairly high institutions of government and so on. I think it's worked pretty well.
So, I mean, I can just relate the situation at Microsoft, which I've become familiar with over the last couple of years. Microsoft has really substantial research centers, in Silicon Valley here, obviously up in Redmond, but also in Beijing and in India and in various places in Europe and in Cambridge and so forth. So they have development centers, certainly for Bing, which is what I'm part of, which are kind of operating, basically it's kind of global development operating 24/7. I mean, there are people, every morning I get 10 messages from India just reporting on what they did, how they contributed, and then the guys in China, and then the guys. So it really is not only incredibly diverse, but really global in the way they are trying to take advantage of all the skills and competencies that are kind of really distributed all over the place.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we may just be a poor country research center here with our 200 researchers, but where they come from is really reflected by what you see when you walk the halls. Is we do have researchers from all over the world here. Their ability to be able to extend our network through their relationships is a pretty profound influence on what we do.
And all of PARC is right here.
That's correct. Yes, but we do have, we've had expats who are off, in Asia. We're there for a couple of years. That's a consequence of the work we do with some of the clients we do. But that it always, any interaction with a client around innovation into a market is a new influence that comes back to PARC.
Hey, I'm Joe Fishkay. I'm at Nokia Research, which is a new lab, I guess, just up the road. We've been around for about 3 or 4 years. And what's interesting is that in many ways, I think Nokia follows this hallowed tradition that Raju kind of referred to of what you do when your company has a functional monopoly, right? You've got all this cash lying around, and it started off, AT&T had this monopoly, Bell, sorry, had this monopoly on phones, like, oh, let's make Bell Labs, right? And then IBM said, well, we've got all these mainframes, and everyone's buying our mainframes, we've got a monopoly on mainframes. Xerox functionally had a monopoly.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of RCA, there's a long
exactly,
list.
And there's a long list of these, right? But I've recently started to pay more and more attention to the sources of innovation I see going on in the world, right? And looking at rates of innovation, and it doesn't really matter what you're looking at, right? There are all these grassroots hacking kind of ways that innovation is happening. And the frequency and accessibility of this seems to be growing far in excess of anything that we've seen before. And I really think we're seeing a fundamental change when I'm not communicating with my colleagues who are at Microsoft Research and IBM, but also MIT and Stanford and LSE and all those various places. I'm talking to them more on Facebook than 10 years ago. You'd see them maybe once a year, right? You go to CHI, you go to whatever your conferences are, you go and meet up in the bar, and that's great. But I mean, I think we're seeing something that's very fundamentally different here. And I think in many ways we're seeing perhaps a democratization of both innovation and invention. And we're seeing sites like YouTube and Instructables taking the place in many ways of communications of the ACM or CHI, or whatever your favorite place that you see being an important site for these conversations to take place. And so I guess my question becomes, if either this is a big change, and there is something really different happening, or it doesn't matter and it's all just the same, and it was like nothing's really changed over the last 30 years, and so we're going to go back to this model of having very large corporations fund this, which, Raj, unless I'm reading you wrong, that was, you were like, currently we're not doing this. And I think it's interesting, for example, we're seeing Google, which has a functional monopoly on search, with all due respect to present company. They're not doing that kind of long-term research, right? They've got Google Labs, but they do stuff that's 2-3 years out. They're not publishing it in the same way that you see sort of contributing to this long-term intellectual discussion. Yes, you got it. That's it. That was like a question.
I think the time period of research or invention is also something we haven't much talked about, but one of the things also that was true of PARC is the ability to kind of take on a hard problem and work on it for 5 or 10 years, as Mark well knows, with, not with some maybe intermediate outputs, but maybe not a lot to justify the ongoing kind of investment. And if you have the right nose for it, you actually, at the end of that period, you come up with something that might be actually quite useful. That's very, very difficult to sustain. PARC was able to do it. Google is maybe not doing it. Maybe, I think Microsoft Research, still has kind of a monopoly, still has that kind of view of things. Even in the universities, it's hard to do because you get peer reviewed every time you have a grant coming up. You can't be too far ahead or too far behind the rest of the people in the field who are going to kind of give you your score. So the challenge of having a long-term bet, and even if you may or may not be publishing, it may be kind of a private thing you're doing, but having that ability to kind of pursue something for a long period of time and maybe come to some sort of fundamental breakthrough. The question of how is that going to be supported over future periods. PARC was able to do it. I don't know that PARC does it so much even now because the constraints have kind of moved in.
Well,
and
we
so forth.
have
Monopolies
to,
help.
Yeah, we have to do it, but we have to be very selective about
You have to be careful
what we do it with. And certainly it's not a thousand flowers bloom. We ask hard questions in order to define which ones we think have the merit to invest over long periods. But it's not the increment of innovation you're referring to, whether it's magical cows or apps in the App Store. It's more about having platform functionality that has the kind of broad potential for application in many different market requirements and different industries.
And you're sort of anticipating the secular trend of the future, that there will be some point where this advanced thinking will actually be economically viable,
Yes.
and actually society or culture will be ready to receive it.
That's right.
And that's a tricky kind of alignment to anticipate.
Yes. Well, it goes back to the
Let me jump in with, if I can.
I've got this great thing. About 10 years, I'll get back to you. Just fund me for the next 10 years, because whenever I try that with my manager, she always turns me down. I feel like there's this mythos that we've all built up around this, and I wonder how often it happens.
That scenario that you just described? Well, it doesn't happen here. I know. I can tell you that.
It did happen.
Well, no, but it doesn't happen here anymore. Yeah.
You have to promise the results in 2 years, and even if it's going to take you 10 years.
Yeah,
That's what you have to do. You promise it in 1 year. You'll get funded.
I think it's this rigor that we talked about having thought enough about the progress towards a long-term goal that you can periodically reflect on the amount of investment you've made, the amount of progress you've made, and are the anticipated barriers as you foresaw them to be, and are they as tractable as you hoped they would be? But yeah, the notion of just I'll get back to you in 10 years is just totally out of sync with. I know it was for metaphorical purposes, but 100 years ago, 10 years ago, probably wasn't a very time-constrained horizon. But the pace of how things can happen today is just infinitely faster.
I think people can.
If somebody told me anyway, well, this will take 10 years as a research project, but I can make it be successful, but it takes me that period of time. I would not regard that as credible, or else it wasn't research. Because if you can tell me what you're going to be doing in 10 years, it is so cut and dry that it's not a research project. Okay, I mean, the statistics would just tell you, no, the chances are so small that either this person has cheated and already done this, okay, and they know that it's inevitable, or they're just seeing shows that aren't in TV Guide, because 10 years for a research project, a priori just doesn't work. After 2 years, you might earn years 3 and 4, and so on and so on. And that's as it should be. Besides, I don't know anybody that would be willing to be shackled, shall we say, indentured to a single project for 10 years that I would want to work with or give any money to, okay?
But if you take off, the 10 years might have been facetious. You know, somebody wants to get funding for something they're passionate about, they believe in, and it's beyond what their manager can okay or what they can conceivably get funded. I think you can find ways to do a chunk in 2 years and just promise a miracle in 2 years, and then people fall in love with it. I mean, it happens, right?
You bet.
And that, I think that's,
passion and vision for it,
Yeah, well, I mean,
and then you can keep going for another 2 years.
you know, Ron and the whole language team, I mean, we didn't say, yes, here's one project and you're going to work on exactly this project for all these years. But we did say, we all agreed, even those of us who didn't have to give the money, we all agreed. We said, this is a capability we ought to be building in this lab. And the expectation was that that team would be here for 10 years or longer and doing work in that space. But no given project, right, had a 10-year kind of
That's right.
horizon.
And we didn't predict exactly which ones would actually pay off as we were exploring that area. So, you know, we did some very early mathematical work. We proved a bunch of theorems about the structure of words and so forth that I mentioned before. And that led to several spin-off companies and probably sold, you know, $500 million worth of stuff that followed from those theorems, which at the time we didn't know what the application was, but we knew that there was something important in that.
Exactly.
And that was kind of the spin out of this much larger kind of goal. So it can happen.
There's also kind of the emperor's new clothes sort of problem where things go along for a while where everybody thinks they're hard to do, long after they are no longer hard to do. And then one day somebody discovers, this isn't actually that hard. You know, like I can write Java even though I didn't write C or Fortran or some godless microcode language. It isn't actually that hard. Boom. And then everything sort of changes. Computer architecture went through this same thing. People said, gosh, I guess you don't have to absolutely minimize every data path anymore. And Intel architecture might not be the best, but it's close enough for government work and it's very cheap. Why don't I just get on with my life? You know? And those discoveries change the playing field every time one of them happens. And so I think that the Nokia gentleman was making this point about, isn't there a lot going on now by being constantly connected in all these instant ways? All that stuff is a perfect case of, oh, this isn't as hard as I thought. Like they just discovered there's all this platform work that's been done by all these other people. Gosh, you know, I can get, you know, MySQL and the LAMP stack and white boxes, and then I can do this thing that I want to do where I really understand the highest level of it, and all of a sudden it's not about plumbing and architecture and all those tough things. And we're in an unbelievable period of innovation now in that space because you don't have to be getting all the best programs on planet Earth to produce something really different, that really, really changes things, okay? And this will go on for a while, and then as someone pointed out earlier, so we're on this plateau where everybody enjoys this new platform. And then we'll eventually hit the end of that, and then there'll be oh God, you know, struggling new hardware and security problems and all the hard stuff that will be required to get to the next level. And that's when it will be, I think, in my opinion, more fun, again, to be in the invention space. Right now, all the attention is on the innovation space because it's going so fast. But it'll run off its railroad tracks here in a few more years, and then it'll be invention time again.